Let's just start. For people who don't know you or aren't familiar with you, tell me a little bit about your background and what made you decide to run for the Kentucky Supreme Court.
Yeah, I'm a dad and a husband, an attorney in Hopkinsville, and I serve in the Kentucky State Senate, Republican senator and chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, representing Christian, Todd, and Logan counties in the state Senate. And I decided to run for the Supreme Court because I see an opportunity to make a difference there. When I ran for the Senate 7 years ago, I wanted to make a difference, and I think I've done that in the last 7 years in the legislature. But the Supreme Court is a place where we desperately need someone to step in and do what the justices are supposed to do, which is to apply the law that exists and not make it up as they go, not legislate from the bench, but the court continues to do that. Certainly didn't expect this race to be going on this year, but when Justice Cunningham stepped out, I've had several months to think about whether or not it's something that we should do. Talked to my wife about it a great deal. We prayed a lot about it and believed that this was an opportunity to try to make that difference. And prayerfully, we will be successful. We'll see.
So the biggest discussion around the Kentucky Supreme Court in recent years is that people make remarks that they're legislating from the bench.
Yeah.
A lot of the biggest pieces of legislation that the legislature has passed in the last couple of years have ended up in front of the court. So how do you feel about that sentiment, and how do you feel about the rulings that have come down on those issues?
The sentiment's right on the nose. The court has engaged in legislating from the bench. My opponent has done the same thing. It's why I believe he's not the best candidate. The court continues to. What it seems they're trying to do is they come up with a result that they think is fair or equitable or right based on the circumstances or based on the parties, and then sort of twist or contort the law and the precedent, or maybe throw it out altogether in some cases, to arrive at that result. Sometimes they're ignoring law that exists. Sometimes they're, again, as I said, upending decades and decades of precedent to do it. It's just frustrating to see a court do that. And when the court starts making decisions based on their philosophical position on issues, you start having a court whose rulings vary by the whims of the members of the court. There's no consistency and reliability there. Laws shouldn't change in the Supreme Court. They should be upheld and applied there. If the law needs to change, go call your state representative or your state senator. I think that sentiment is right on the nose.
So here in Kentucky, we elect our judges in a
We do.
nonpartisan fashion. In other states, they're appointed, and in some other states, they're also elected, but in partisan races. So
Right.
how do you feel about the way Kentucky decides who's on the Supreme Court, and how do we elevate these type of races so that the voters understand that they do get to elect, these positions and pay more attention and make an educated decision?
Well, I think things like what you all are doing with the Kentucky Chamber, bringing awareness to races, is a good thing, and other organizations are doing that. And I think the more awareness and the more reminding of people that this is a race that's going on, I think it's a good thing. I think we fall behind in civics education with our communities statewide, nationwide as it is, and that covers all kinds of government elections. I think the judicial races being nonpartisan is good, but I also think justices or candidates for that position should be able to say what their thoughts are, should be able to say what their positions are, should be able to say, as I am, a lifelong Republican, an elected Republican to the state legislature now. I don't think I should have to hide that, and for many years that's what judicial candidates have done. I'm not ashamed of it, and I think it also helps people understand sort of where people are coming from philosophically and understand their approach to certain things. I said this morning as we had a forum here in Paducah with the Paducah Chamber between my opponent and me, and I mentioned the fact that I'm a lifelong Republican, but more importantly, I'm a constitutional conservative. I'm someone who believes in the original text of the Constitution and applying that text to whatever modern day case comes up, not changing it or extrapolating beyond what's written or codified, not looking at the constitutional debates, which no one voted on. That's not codified law, but our court continues to do that. I think it's important, though, that people understand what kind of candidate you are so they know what kind of judge to expect when you win.
So you've been in the state Senate for quite some time now,
Yeah.
and you understand the important role the legislature plays, but what do you feel is the most important role of the Kentucky Supreme Court?
Two things. One, the court needs to keep its mind on the efficiency of the court system. We have places in Kentucky where the system is so delayed and so backed up, where the dockets are so heavy, that people's cases are resolved just because they've waited and sat long enough, because they can't get a hearing. soon enough. That's awful. And if you're a litigant in that case, you're getting hurt. Businesses are holding up their investments. There's an organization around E-Town that's waiting on the Supreme Court to decide to take the case. Not even to rule on it yet, just to take it or not. And they've been waiting almost a year. It shouldn't take that long for 7 justices to decide whether or not to even hear the darn case. But while they're waiting, that business can't invest. That property they're trying to get some decision on is sitting there vacant. The community that's relying on that business to provide that service can't get the service. The court needs to be mindful of those things and be aware of the inefficiencies that exist. It's also part of the reason that I think I bring a better perspective to this race. My opponent has been on the bench for 13 years. Most of the justices on the court now have been on the bench for longer than that. And they haven't been practicing law on the front lines on a day-to-day basis since before the iPhone existed. And so they've long lost touch with what their rulings do to the system and what their rulemaking does for the system. And I think someone with that fresh perspective needs to be there on the court to fix it.
Let's talk about your background in the state Senate, and you have also been a lawyer. So what do you bring to this role as a Supreme Court justice if you were to win? And what are some of the things you've done in your career that illustrate your judicial philosophies?
Sure. Well, I think I bring that day-to-day experience, that present-day experience of practicing law. We're recording this on a Thursday morning. I was in court yesterday. I'll be in court again tomorrow. I know what it's like to work in the court system on a day-to-day basis today, and I understand the impact of the rulings the court makes, not only on the cases, but also in the rulemaking. As part of the Judiciary Chairmanship, I sit on the Evidence Rules Review Commission, and we have already started meeting again on a proposed rule of evidence. There are things that can be done that I've got firsthand experience with that my opponent doesn't, and immediate experience with that my opponent hasn't had in more than a decade, and I think that needs to be brought to bear on the Supreme Court. My time in the legislature has been marked by work that impacts the judicial system, whether it's juvenile justice reform or bigger criminal justice reform or bail reform and a host of other issues that impact the courts at every level. I think that experience is invaluable. Between that and my years in private practice where I've litigated at every level of the court system in one variety or another, my time as a prosecutor, I think all of that informs a well-rounded legal experience and background to bring to the court. And unique in the sense that I'm a sitting legislator and have that time as the judiciary chair that my opponent doesn't. I think the court desperately needs that sort of experience in that seat.
So on the same page as judicial philosophy, of any Supreme Court justice at the federal level, U.S. Supreme Court, past or present, what justice do you most admire and why?
I think the first answer would probably Antonin Scalia. His career on the court sort of coincides with my legal career and adult life. I associate most closely with him philosophically. His originalism and textualism approach to the Constitution and interpretation, I very much align with. I like the late Justice Scalia, and I admire him probably the most. But I also really like, there's an example that I want to cite, Justice Gorsuch, President Trump's first nominee to the court. To fill the late Scalia's seat. There was actually a ruling earlier this year where Justice Gorsuch broke with the conservative bloc of the Supreme Court and wrote a dissent in a case involving the double jeopardy clause of the Constitution. And I believe he nailed it. I think his dissent was right on the money, but he had to show independence from the conservative philosophical group of the court to do that, and I think that's also good. I think a member of the court, you're not going to be a conservative or a liberal in the political sense. You're going to apply the law, period. And sometimes you line up with the left and sometimes you line up with the right. And you've got to be prepared, even if you're standing alone in a dissent, to do that. And I love that. And I'm grateful to see that even early on in his tenure on the court, Justice Gorsuch is willing to do that. And I would expect to be doing a lot of the same work on the Kentucky Supreme Court.
Finally, is there anything we haven't covered that you want people to know or understand? And what is your pitch to the people of this district about why you should be on the Kentucky Supreme Court?
First, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to talk about the race. You know, between my legal career, where I've litigated at every stage of or level of the Kentucky court system, and my time over the last nearly a decade chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee, where I've worked in the legislature as a Republican senator and a 5-time MVP of the Kentucky Chamber, I've been able to work on policy that affects the judiciary at every level and affects litigants at every level. And I think that experience is invaluable. I think the fact that I've been able to work to bring different voices in the legislature together in service of a legislative goal, but also on occasion be willing to stand on my own if that's what I have to do to stand for a cause that I believe in, I think also serves me well should I be on the Supreme Court. I believe I can get other justices to see my rationale and see why they're not applying the law correctly. But even if I can't, even if I'm the only one and I think the rest of the court is going beyond its duty to apply the law as it exists, and I'm the only one that is doing that, then I'm willing to do that. And I'm prepared, I've got that experience and I'm ready to do that again. And then finally, I think the fact that I've been practicing law and still practicing today on the front lines, I think is an invaluable perspective that the court desperately needs. It hasn't had someone who's been active in practicing law on the front lines in a long time. And I think that needs to be fixed. And I'm the only candidate in the race that offers that perspective. We've got an opportunity here to choose between someone who's going to, on occasion, supplant their own views and philosophical approach or what they desire in an outcome for what the law requires. To do what then Judge Gorsuch said, to stretch to find a result they prefer rather than the one the law demands. Or you can elect someone who's going to apply the law and defer the legislative work to the legislative branch elected by the people. We can't afford the status quo. We can't afford to let passion or prejudice cloud our judgment. This is the Supreme Court, and we count on them to uphold and defend the rule of law. And that's exactly what I commit to do as Kentucky's next First District Justice. It's a promise I could make because it's one I've made for the last 7 years and kept as a senator in the Kentucky State Senate. I'd remind people also that if you're in these 24 counties out in the West, from Edmonson County to Fulton County, that if you're a straight ticket voter, I'd remind you to vote straight ticket +1 on November 5th because this is a nonpartisan race. To remind people that straight ticket would skip it if you don't add that +1. So I'm looking forward to the last 60 days here.